Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon.
I think we are 5 minutes late already, and we should commence our conversations for today. I'm going to be moderating the session this afternoon. I welcome every one of us wherever we're joining from. Today we are going to be discussing chapter 5 of Aribiah's book, Groundwork for a New Kind of African Metaphysics. And in chapter 5, the theme for that chapter is determinism and the death of free will. Determinism and the death of free will. So in this chapter, let me begin by saying that, the author of this work, Aribiah, began by making us understand that in African metaphysics, there is this belief that, God gives each and every one his or her destinies. So destinies have already been designed by God, and he used that to launch the whole idea of the fact that wherever we want to look at it from, our lives have actually been determined. Our lives have actually been determined. So, and he used his concept of PDH, predeterministic historicity, to explain what his thoughts there. Well, having hoped that we've all gone through the work, we could begin to give our individual takes on it, on the work. So, but let me begin by stating that, let me open the conversation by stating clearly that, in Aribiah's work, it's, when going through it, I actually also think that, it's a thorough work on metaphysics. It gives you that feel of engaging in a metaphysical discourse. It has its own problems. Towards the conclusion of that chapter, Aribiah acknowledged the fact that, this metaphysics is going to create some crisis. However, he decided to delve into it, making us at the same time understand that this work is actually descriptive, not prescriptive. And because it is descriptive, he was very careful in making recommendations on what he thinks, should guide our lives. So I want us to have this picture in mind as we begin. So I have a hand up already. Umezurike, please, you could go ahead with your contributions.
Okay, thank you so very much. Thank you so very much. I'm delighted to be here. Actually, like you rightly said, Arabia's work is quite engaging.
Yes.
At least thought-provoking. It's not the metaphysics as usual.
Yes.
What we used to know, because, and that is why, for me, I think it's something worthwhile. Because when you are reading his work, almost every line would like to fault it and all that. And for me,
sorry. Hold on, Muzurike, before you continue, yeah, you could also show your face if the place is convenient, and so also all other contributors, if where you are is convenient for you, can show your face. But if it's not, it's fine. Continue.
Okay, but I can see you. Okay. But issues are because every event has a cause. It's a very wonderful thing. And again, the angle he looked at it, it didn't really approach it like other scholars have talked about it, like Aristotle and the rest of them. I think his own is more practical than many scholars who have delved into this issue of cause and effect and all that. But I have some issues. But I think I have two questions and an observation. Like 2 questions and 1 observation. Now, 1 question goes like this. If we agree with Dr. Aribiah that the world is completely deterministic, as he argued, Aribiah, sorry, don't you think there will be no room for complementarity? Or better still, the idea of single complementarity. Yes, because if the world is completely deterministic, it is that kind of perfect world or solipsistic world that needs no other things to exist or needs no complementation. That's first, okay? Then the second one is, I was wondering, I don't know whether Attoe is conversant with Olaritum, because I'm not to be blamed. If he is, I want to make emphasis using that background. The conflict between the gods and Odewale, for instance, Odewale actually, according to them, it was predestined by the God that one day he will kill his father and marry his mother. Though Odewale had the opportunity of resisting this curse upon him, or this predestination upon him, though the way, I don't want to go and start talking about the way it was picked up by Benga and the rest of them, but I want to say that he struggled and struggled and struggled because of this freedom and the free will and all that. And eventually got to Ipetu Bush, where he finally saw his father unknown to him. He killed the father in the land dispute and eventually married his mother. Then people say that the gods are not to be blamed because Odewale was given the opportunity, the freedom to decide not to even search for his background and all that. But the gods are not to blame is because of that free will, or the other idea of free willism that bestowed upon Odewale, which he could not use. So many people felt that Odewale should be blamed. But in the case of this author's work, is predeterministic historicity, I'm saying that the gods should be blamed and not Odewale, not the other way around. Yes, because going by the author's notion of determinism, or his somewhat attachment to determinism, it shows that whatever thing that happened to Odewale, of course, have been arranged by the gods. So the gods should be blamed in this case. And on that note, I want to ask, what is the place of blame or reprehensibility in this predeterministic historicity? Okay, am I got it, sir?
Yes, hello? Yes.
Okay,
yes.
What is the place of blame or reprehensibility in predeterministic historicity or relationality? And again, one observation, like I pointed out when I was starting, is the fact that at the tail end of his work, he made us understand that responsibility, which for me is the consequence of freedom. Though I didn't expect him to accept it, because already he has talked about that he has said that he doesn't believe in freedom or free willism, as case might be. So I don't expect him to agree. But then my problem is that along the line, he says that there's need to replace this word responsibility. And I was thinking that that is the heart or the cornerstone of his work. I was expecting him to come up with probably a good word that can replace responsibility. If he's saying that there's no need, the word responsibility should be discarded. So I was expecting him to tell us what should replace responsibility. Of course, we know that the consequence of freedom is responsibility. If it's denying freedom or saying no to freedom, and then saying that something needs to replace responsibility, I was expecting him to point out that particular thing that should replace responsibility, which he didn't mention. He said something else, not the responsibility, but something else. Something else should, play, not the responsibility and all that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Muzurike, for your contribution. So I hope the author of the work is with us listening and making some notes so that at the end of our conversation, he could also provide some responses to them. You could also use the chat box and drop your chats, as we discussed. Just to recap, Arabia, so Umezurike has a problem with the notion of freedom and responsibility. Since we are not free, it means we cannot be held liable. We cannot be blamed for anything. And it's also, for me, to add to his question, when people commit offense, so your metaphysics suggests that people cannot also be criminally liable.
Yes.
Yeah, cannot also be criminally liable for acts committed. So you may do well to respond to this at the end. Yes, Maduka Imba, your hand is up. Unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much, Negudo. And good afternoon, comrades. I want to begin by saying that Arabia's work is quite interesting, very intriguing, but at the same time, very discomforting in some areas, which I'm going to be mentioning some of them. Another important thing about his work I must mention before I go ahead is that you see coherency, of thought. From chapter 1 to the end, you keep, it flows coherently. His argument follows. Just like Bezrike has said, as he rejects fragmentalism, of course, it follows that he should reject responsibility. So, having said that, there are two issues I would like to raise that bothers me really. Number one is his exclusion of the spiritual in the predeterministic world that he creates. The second is his rejection of free will. So let me begin with the first. To understand clearly his theory of predeterministic historicity, one will need to understand his idea of causality because it flows from there, which is actually the chapter 4, then chapter 5, where he eventually starts discussing his rejection of free willism. He termed it the death of free willism. According to his account of causality, which informs his predeterministic theory, Arabia rejects the predominant African view that incorporates the spiritual in the explanation of causal relationship. Causality for him is an active representation of the interactive relationship that must exist among realities in a deterministic world. That's how I define causality. The question that arises here and that bothers me is this: what is Arabia's understanding of reality? Does reality not include the spiritual? And if it does, what is the place of the spiritual in the deterministic world he creates? Again, does the spiritual as an aspect of reality not have any role to play in the interactive relationship he is exposing exists in the deterministic world he creates? This is because, for me, his exclusion of the spiritual from the existence, from reality, bothers me. That leads to me asking the question: what does he what is his conception of reality? Because the spiritual, for me, is an inextricable part of the world, or a part of reality. And for Arabia to exclude it in his construction of a deterministic world, or in the construction of reality, raises the question of what does reality mean for him. Now, if we go further again, still on this issue of excluding the spiritual, if you go to page 70 of his work, page 70 of Arabia's work, you will see him making reference to Thaddeus Mez's quotation of Okolo, where Okolo states that to exist means more than just being there. It means standing in particular relationship with all there is, both visible and invisible, unquote. In response to this statement, Arabia accepts this claim as apt because it ensures the necessary relationship and interaction among things. The question comes back again. It raises the question of his exclusion of the spiritual in such a relationship, while still accepting the interaction between the visible and the invisible. So I ask, is the invisible not constitutive or suggestive of the spiritual? Why and how does he exclude the spiritual among realities, and yet accepts the interrelationship between the visible and invisible? I think that the spiritual suggests or implies invisible, which is an aspect of reality that relates itself. So that's that about his exclusion of the spiritual in his construction of a deterministic of a deterministic world or reality. Now, to the second part, as I conclude my comments, is his rejection of free will. Still, from page 770 down, you will see Arabia describe the universe as without purpose, and as such, irrational. Describe the universe as irrational, thereby rejecting the possibility of free will. Going on, he still states that all types of reality possesses, I'm quoting Arabia now, all types of reality possesses interactive power and an interactive hold between and among themselves. Then the question is, what is this interactive power? For me, power implies ability possessed by a thing or someone, to do or not do carry on or not carry out a particular action, do or not do a particular thing, So, and he says that all types of reality possesses interactive power and an interactive hold between and among themselves. This, for me, implies and suggests some kind of willpower. I'm talking about the rejection of free will to relate or interact, possessed by realities among themselves. This further again, points to the fact that his rejection of free will because of his idea of causality is a bit problematic here, because he seems to still be accepting unwittingly the fact that reality still possesses some power to interact, which means they might also, assuming a particular aspect of reality or particular aspects of reality, decides not to utilize such power in order not to interact. What happens? For me, at that point, it could offset the supposed predeterministic relationship. And this is where we can account for the spiritual aspect of reality. You see, and not the way he is looking at it, where he seems to not want to run into accepting the predominant African view of including the spiritual, and then it will look like he's supporting supernaturalism and superstition. This is not the way it should be. So finally, if, for example, a certain man following his idea of free willism, called Mr. Kenneth, is said to have been predetermined by previous interactions, previous events, interactive events in his lineage, in his distant past, in his blood lineage, for instance, he's been predetermined by this previous interaction in his family, in his bloodline, to be a local carpenter. And then as a result, this young man by name Kenneth starts, relating with others as he's growing up. He finds himself in a circle of friends where there are interactions, and these new interactions in his life leads to him, being a part of this circle of friends who have now become prominent persons in the society. And then by his interaction with these people, as he proceeds in the world, the so predeterministic world, he by, should we call it by chance, or by, I don't want to use a free will yet, but by chance or by dint of hard work, he now turns out to become a prominent a scholar, and not ending as a carpenter, as his predetermined destiny in quote had designed for him. But by the interactions in later years of his life with other persons, he had now become something else other than what was predetermined. Is this not still free willism, embedded in that predeterministic theory? You see, so these are some of the few things I want to raise concerning Arabia's interesting and novel ideas. The issue of excluding spiritual from explanation of the nature of reality, and the free will that seem to be embedded, implied even in that predeterminism. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Maduka, for your take. The question has come up again. I remember in one of his presentations, Aribiah made reference to the idea of God, and he defined it as, of course, something that is material. So, and we had no time to have that conversation because, because time ran out. I think Aribiah, you have the time to attend to these issues very well this afternoon. We are going to take Nelson. When we take Nelson, Aribiah, you will just give you time to respond to these three conversationalists. Then we'll go to Lucky. So Nelson, over to you, please.
Okay, good afternoon once again. I want to quickly go straight to the subject of discourse. First and foremost, I must commend this work by Dr. Aribiah. And then to begin, I would say that personally as an individual, I have been really blessed by his writings, and that has made me to do a lot of rethink about the idea of metaphysics within the African worldview. However, having taken time to go through this chapter on that discussion, I've been able to draw up some kind of areas which I think would need clarification and redress. Now, first and foremost, I like the fact that, and which I want to quickly say, the idea of determinism, according to Dr. Aribiah, is that which implies that all actions and factors, all things in the world are necessarily relational in their being in the world, or by virtue of their being in the world. And from here, he was able to argue against the notion of free willism or free will. And he argued in page 86 that free will, having negated what free willism is, that there's nothing like free willism or choice. He went further in page 86 to say that free will, if it must not be determinism, would imply two possibilities of what he calls dislinked effect. That is, the possibility of a state of affairs which is not linked to a previous state of affairs. This further implies that free will, freely willing, involves the power to do any of the following two things. One, to change a necessary state of affairs and or to weigh decisions or actions, outcomes that are non-relational to other actors and factors in the world. Two, the ability required to will a state of affairs or an outcome that is different from a necessary predetermined state of affairs is an ability that is well beyond the power of human beings. Now, he further argued that it would be similar to willing that 1 + 1 = 4 and expecting that equation is incorrect. That is, the level of power that free willism presupposes, and such powers do not exist or are not available to humans for now. Now, critically looking at these points made by Dr. Aribiah, I would argue I see some contradictions here. He had, first and foremost, he argued against the notion of free willism, and thereafter talked about what he called the dislinked effect, that there are actually some choices that could come that may not necessarily follow the natural state of affairs, which he called dislinked effect. And he also said here that this dislinked effect is beyond the power of the human beings to exhibit. I see I see a problem there, because you have already told us that there's nothing like free willism, that what we only have is determinism, and that every determined action, will, or thought, or action must necessarily follow from a causal effect. And that every action must necessarily follow from a causal effect. And here he's telling us that there are some actions that may not necessarily follow from a causal effect, and that they are categorized as what he calls dislinked effects. And by being dislinked effects, they are also beyond the activity or the capability of humans to perform or to carry out. Now, the question lies there. The question is, who are those, or what category of beings are those that exhibit this dislinked effect, since it is beyond that of humans? And by pointing out the fact that 1 + 1 could be, in an attempt to argue against the idea of free willism, he said that one could talk about 1 + 1 as being 4 and expecting to have a different result. But he seemed to forget that in applied mathematics, or what you call the philosophy of mathematics, 1 + 1 could be 4. 1 + 1 may not necessarily be 2. Because when we talk about the 2 goats and 2 yams, what we have is 2 fat goats, because the goat necessarily will eat up the yams. So that is a contradiction, as it has to do with other aspects of reality, like applied mathematics. He seems to subscribe or reduce his idea of determinism to pure mathematics by bringing in this argument. Another issue I see with his work is that he raised hypothetical stories about one Okonkwo, in terms of an asteroid hitting the Earth and then the physical that existed between the lives of one Adam and Cain, wherein the latter had to a kind of hit Adam or hit Cain with a stick, and maybe he died, and also he was arrested. Now,
Yes.
I think my own argument is that his idea of fatal determinism, which is used to argue against Okonkwo in his hypothetical story about an asteroid hitting the Earth, is only relevant from the aftermath effect of that action. In other words, it is only said to be true within the contingent propositional understanding of reality. So that idea of his fatal determinism can only be said to be true within contingent propositions. It seemed to be limited because it did not look at the future referential, propositions, wherein and in terms of the nature of determinism, in which a variable can either be possible or impossible, as the case may be, true or impossible, as the case may be. So I see a lot of problems with that. I think he will need to possibly clarify that idea of fatal determinism and what he's trying to communicate. And from the point made by Dr. Maduka and the previous speaker, I think they are quite on point, because his idea of reality has not been able to show, when he was talking about invincible, the invincible has not been the same thing as the spiritual. Meanwhile, within the African worldview, the African worldview or the African metaphysical experience comprises the spiritual. We have an understanding of what is spiritual as different from what is material. So I think these are the positions I would like to submit now before, while I await on other speakers to make their contributions for further analysis. Thank you.
All right, yeah, thank you, Nelson, for your contributions and your questions. So, Aribia, you would please respond to these three contributors, then we'll come over to you, Lucky, afterwards. Aribia.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Negudu, and everyone that is here and is contributing. First of all, I feel a bit elated that people have actually read my work. It's not something I take for granted. And everyone has raised their important points. But before I respond to them, I would also want to suggest to other speakers and even to those who have spoken to also tell me, because I'm interested to know, anything that they've learned from what they've read, any point that they agree with or anything like that. Not just the criticisms, which are also very important and interesting. I also want to know what you guys and ladies have learned from reading the work and all that. But that's fine. So I'll respond to the question, everybody's question. First was Dr. Umezurike, whose first question was along the lines of, if we agree that the world is deterministic, would there be any room for complementarity? Seeming to suggest that the deterministic world does not or cannot include complementation. My response to that is, in the previous chapters of the work, and even in this chapter of the work, the reason for the determinism that I propose is complementarity itself. Complementarity is the foundation from which this determinism springs from. It's not the other way around. So yes, there is room for complementarity within a deterministic world. And in fact, it is because of complementarity that we have this deterministic world, in my opinion. And if you read chapter 3 and chapter 4, you'll see why that is the case. And then his second question was about Olarirotimi's famous book and whether we should place blame on the gods or not with regards to the main character's incest, and also the main character's decision to kill his father and all that. I'm not sure how that is would be relevant. So again, we must go back to chapter 2 where I discussed the idea of God, and you see that my idea of God is different from what Olarotimi was thinking. But in a way, you can, if you must blame, you can blame the first cause for the main character's actions, and you blame it for being the way it is, because if it wasn't the way it is, different state of affairs would have emanated, and perhaps the world would have been different from the way it is now. So if you must blame something, you can decide to blame the first cause. And then he said something about what should replace the idea of responsibility, that I suggested that responsibility should be replaced, but did not provide any alternative and all that. That is not particularly true, because in page 95, I did say that what replaces responsibility in this metaphysics can only merely involve acknowledgement, recognition, or awareness that a certain expression emanates from a certain factor. So you replace responsibility with acknowledgement. So rather than blame Mr. A, or rather than blame King Leopold II for maiming and killing over 20 million Congolese people, rather than blame find him responsible for that, my view would be that you acknowledge that this person expressed himself in that way, right? That this person killed. You can only acknowledge what the person has done. You cannot, find the person responsible within the context of my metaphysics. And I think that answers the question about whether people can be criminally viable within the context of my metaphysics. So that's it for Dr. Mezurike. And I'll move on to Dr. Maduka. He says, he asked me what my understanding of reality is and whether it includes the spiritual and all that, whether the spiritual has any role to play and all that. My response to that is this: it depends on how you define the spiritual. In fact, African metaphysics is notorious for not having a clear-cut definition of what spiritual means. Most people have to resort to Descartes' description of what the immaterial or what the spiritual is, in trying to understand what most African metaphysicians, especially those of the past, mean by the term spiritual. Now, to answer Dr. Maduka's first question, you must go back to the second chapter where I described what I mean by materiality. So in my definition of materiality, I said anything that can affect the world, anything that can be involved in an interaction with other things in the world is necessarily material. So if you describe spiritual things, I presume you mean things like ancestors or spirits or things like that. If you describe those sorts of beings as being able to affect the world, if you can prove that they can affect the world or they can interact with any other thing in the world, then you must consider them material. And they are part of the world, really, right? That is, it falls under my understanding of what materiality means. Now, if you're talking about a being that cannot affect this world, this universe that we are living in, if you're talking about that sort of being, then that being is immaterial, according to my definition of what material and immaterial means. And I said it somewhere in the book, it is similar to what you would call, or what Dr. Jonathan calls Ife Nkiti. Dr. Jonathan and our very own Dr. Lucky, what they call Ife Nkiti, at least from my reading of it, my understanding of it, something properly otherworldly, and otherworldly in the sense that it cannot interact with anything in this world. And for me, if such a being exists, if at all such a being exists, I'm not sure it does, but if at all it does exist, those beings are not part of this world. And I do not waste my time trying to define them or trying to think about them, because they do not affect anything, any other thing in this world that we are living. So I do not concern myself with them, right? So to answer Dr. Maduka's question, it depends on what you mean by spiritual. If by spiritual you mean things that can affect the world in one way or the other, then you're actually talking about material things from my own definition of what materiality means. And then he also said something about Okolo's quotation where he mentioned visible and invisible. There are many invisible things that are, traditionally material in the traditional definition of what materiality means. So viruses are invisible, but they exist, they are material things. But that's not what I was thinking about. When I was, considering invisible, I was considering things that even though we cannot, see them or feel them or whatever, they still interact with the world in one way or the other. Now, if those things exist and if they interact with the world, then they must be classified as material, according to my own definition of what materiality means. And then the next question he asked was something about interactive power and whether that does not imply free willism. But it does not imply free willism, because remember in chapter 3, I mentioned that the interactions, the complementarity that exists within things in the world is necessary. It is not arbitrary. It is not based on willingness, right? It is necessary. So once something exists in the world, it necessarily interacts with other things in the world. And it is that interaction, that's the interactive power that I'm talking about. So because it necessarily interacts with other things in the world, that cuts out the idea of free will and all that stuff. Okay. Then he talked about a certain Kenneth that was supposed to predetermine to be a carpenter. And then he met some friends, and then he suddenly became a very prominent member of society. Doesn't that prove free will? Well, it doesn't, because it basically buttresses my point, which is, first of all, predeterminism is not thought of in the classical sense that you think of it, which is there is a certain being overlording the world, and before people are born, he gives them a predetermined destiny, what you would find in Shegun Badegesin's work and Balogun's work. That's not what I mean by predeterminism. It is a predeterminism because of the first cause. The first cause exists the way it did, and because of its mode of existence, it led to the world that we have now. If it didn't exist the way it did, we'll probably not have the world we have now. That's why it's a predeterminism in the first instance. And so when Kenneth interacts with these new friends, that is the new state of affairs and new interactions within that new state of affairs. And that interaction leads to newer state of affairs, which is how Kenneth became, a prominent member of society, even though in a previous state of affairs, he was on his way to becoming a very not so prominent carpenter. So you see that even in that story, you are just, portraying the vision I have in mind as to how the world works. Okay, so then down to Nelson, he talked about the view, what I said about distinct effect. No, I wasn't saying that there is determinism, and then apart from this determinism, there is something called distinct effect. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I was saying is that if we take free willism to be true, like most people like to do, I'm sure most of us like to take free willism as true. If we take free willism as true, what we are actually saying is that a distinct effect is possible. Because you are saying that the world is going through a particular trajectory, and then a human being decides that no, a different trajectory is better, and builds that new trajectory into effect, setting aside the previous causal history that might have followed before he or she made that decision. That is what free willism means. Free willism means the distinct effect I'm talking about. And so what I'm saying is that if you believe free willism is true, then you must believe that the distinct effect is true. But it is impossible for the distinct effect to be true. Therefore, free willism is false. That is the trajectory of the argument. It is not that there is determinism here, but in certain circumstances, there are certain beings or certain things that can produce a distinct effect. No, that is not what I was saying. I was just saying that free willism is impossible, because if we agree that free willism is true, then we must believe in a distinct effect, but a distinct effect is false or implausible as far as the world we live in today is concerned. So that is it about the idea of distinct effect. And then the second question, I didn't quite get it, something about the second example I gave. I think what I was trying to say in that example is we have this sort of arrogance as human beings that the world was, made for our own use, and that we can freely do whatever we like with it. But then the example was meant to show that this is not true. Anything can happen based on certain other interactions that we may not be aware of. Just recently, I saw a documentary on National Geographic Channel, which showed that at a certain point in history, not too long ago anyway, we barely missed, by just a few miles, an asteroid that was going to, or that could have, decimated the planet. We barely missed it by a few miles. And scientists, and I was shocked to find out that scientists and astronomers and all that cannot tell, for sure that this sort of event will not happen again, or that they cannot predict that some stray asteroid cannot come and hit Earth. And the truth is that this thing has been happening time immemorial. Most of our extinctions, most of the 5 major extinctions we've had in this planet is due to asteroid strikes. I was surprised that we have no defenses against it. It can happen anytime. We cannot predict it until it is too late, So that was the point of the whole example. So it is the arrogance of the human being to think that, well, we inhabit this made for us planet and that nothing bad can happen to us. So that's what the story was trying to portray. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you, Aribiah, for those explanations. Well, I recall very well that Umezurike and Maduka's first comment was that one thing about your metaphysics is the fact that in the midst of all the problems, one may have with it, it is very coherent. And, some points you just noted for me, which I think I would say I noted 2 things from your comments, from your responses. One is the fact that, yes, the world is determined, and everything around it is determined by, of course, what you say the first cause is. Whatever that first cause is, if the first cause takes another trajectory, then it will also reorder, the course of the world. That is one point you note. Then secondly, well, even though you don't want to say directly, for you in your metaphysics, everything is material. There are no spiritual beings. So I'll call on Lucky to make his contribution now. Please, Lucky, please, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Negedu. I hope I'm audible.
Yes,
Hello?
you are audible. You are audible. Yes, you are.
Yeah, I thank Arabia for this wonderful piece. I appreciate his way of writing. I think he has proved his worth as a dialectic philosopher. He has really shown that his idea of a singular complementarity can always come to play in any of the subject matter he's engaged in. And we can see it in the way he had played over the concept of predeterminism and free willism. He has shown that both concepts are singular complements. Even when he tried to say that there is nothing like free willism, in the other way, he's saying that it does exist within a predeterministic world. So we see the way he writes shows that he's a philosopher who can say no to a thing and say yes to the same thing in another way. So we need to really understand the way Arabia writes. And I think that is where John Bosco really has a problem with him. John Bosco is just looking at him to argue in one direction, but Arabia is not just arguing in one direction. He's showing that a particular concept can be understood from another angle. So Maduka also needs to understand Arabia from this purview. And that's why when he was explaining his idea of predeterminism, he demonstrated that he's going towards what we call, I might call, or I think Met have said it, that it's soft determinism. And this soft determinism is what I might call the causal determinism. It is based on the causal relationship that exists among physical, or what he says is material reality. So it is only within this causal relationship among material reality that we can talk about determinism, not any spiritual entity that exists outside the material world. So with that, we see that everything is determined because we all are connected, or every existent reality is connected within the web of a material existence. With that said, I have just one problem that I want Arabia to address. If in your predeterministic metaphysics or predeterministic historicity, you're saying that there is no free will in terms of absolute free will, independent of predeterminism, and that there is no responsibility. If one is not free to act, then one cannot be responsible for his or her action, because his or her action has been determined by the causal relationship he or she is into. Why do you still say that the person can be punished for his or her action? I think you need to really explain. I know you try to bring in a idea of trying to restore harmony, that punishment is meant to restore harmony. If you say punishment is meant to restore harmony, the person's action, does it not really distort harmony? Does it not bring about disharmony? If it does, the person should know that his or her action can cause disharmony among this material universe, this predetermined material universe. So his or her understanding should bring about responsibility. So I want you to really explain your idea of responsibility or lack of responsibility in connection to this idea of punishment you are subscribing to. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Lucky, for that. Well, there is also an aspect of the question I think Maduka raised, which of course you may reply after, you may respond to after we take this sets of contributions, which is about the fact of rationality, that it seems, your metaphysics downplays rationality, even though, when I read that chapter 5, there is an aspect of your work which, in the final analysis, in all our contributions and in all our questions, Arabia would want to tell us that we have actually even been determined to think this way, to think the way we think. So I think, added to Lucky's question, you also remember to respond to that coming from Maduka. Please, over to you, Patrick. Then we'll take Jonathan. Then we'll give room for Arabia. Patrick.
All right, thank you very much. I think the work is very interesting. I love the coherency of the whole analysis of the rigid predeterministic framework, and I found it very interesting. However, I have a few questions. It shares some similarities with what Dr. Locke has just raised and also other speakers. Particularly, my concern is in the area of morality. So, Aribiah talks about everything following previous state of affairs, interaction between present state of affairs and previous state of affairs, and going backwards in that particular order until we get to the regressively eternal first cause, which is responsible for everything in the universe. But then in his analysis, he said something about the rationale for punishment being flawed, and then why it also stems from a misunderstanding that the reason why people act in certain ways is particularly because they have been predetermined to act in that way. I very much agree with the coherency of the whole analysis from the beginning to that particular point. But I also have a problem with his notion that the reason why human beings insist on punishment is based on a flawed rationale. If you say it is based on a flawed rationale, I think that is a contradiction, because the people who are having a flawed rationale have been predetermined to have a flawed rationale. At the end of the day, we don't make sense of anything if we want to follow it to the logical conclusion. So what that means is that we have no right to question those who act in certain ways, and we also have no right to question those who punish those who act in certain ways. And then the questions or responses he is trying to provide to our criticism of the work is also futile, because he has been predetermined to provide those responses, not because they are the right answers, or they are even rational to begin with, but it's simply because he just has to say it like a robot. He has no role in it. And this is very problematic. It has implications not just for morality, but also for rationality. Are human beings rational at all? Can we ever consciously take actions out of our own volition without hinging it on some regressively eternal first cause being responsible for that some way? That's the first aspect on morality. But generally, this is why I have problem with this method of thinking. So in the book, I think in the chapter around page 67 to 8, there is this analysis, Nelson brought it up also, where to address the point on the predeterminism of everything in the universe. Attoe provides an example that claims that we cannot will 1 + 1 = 4, that to do so would be incorrect. I agree with that particular analysis. However, the problem with this example is that it is disanalogous because it is some sort of a categorical error. Firstly, numbers are abstract entities and their existence is independent of the mind. So it makes no sense to will that 1 + 1 = 4 simply because it appeals to our senses or we feel that particular way. Similarly, we cannot will that 1 3 + 1 cow should equal 1 river. This is because free will is associated with animate objects. When we talk about free will, we are talking about conscious human beings who have some sense of thinking or reasoning about nature or their environment, interacting with the environment. So we don't relate it with inanimate objects. That particular class of entities in the context of talking about our relationship with our environment seems to be a categorical error. That's what I find. And then secondly, I have an example. If I decide to go on a vacation to the Maldives, and at the 11th hour, I decide to go to the Seychelles instead, was my mind predetermined to make that change in my course of action or my preferred location for vacation? The predeterminist would say, okay, it is that particular case, maybe there are some external factors. But I can also provide the argument that there is no current information that says something better just came up in the Seychelles or something bad just happened in the Maldives, which has also interacted with my whole makeup, biological, sociological, environmental, and the rest to make me to prefer Seychelles. But I just decide to, for no reason, let me just go here. All these places are vacation locations, so I can just pick either of them without being determined by any factor or without. If I go to the Maldives, I get the same sunshine. I go to the Seychelles, I get the same sunshine. So I just decide, let me switch at the last minute to do this without any cause, without any reason. So in that particular instance, does predeterminism still hold water? And then to do so, when we argue about predeterminism and insist that it is so rigid that there is nothing that we do, that any course of action we take is not out of our own free will or whatever, another implication would be also to deny the evolutionary structure of the universe, that the universe is expanding generally, because expansion happens in an adirectional atmosphere. We cannot say that previous state of affairs would determine the direction of expansion or evolution of organisms in the universe. Otherwise, everything was just mapped out by this singular, regressively eternal first cause. And the existence of many deviations in nature proves this not to be actually the case. Thank you. That will be it for now.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Patrick, for that contribution. So towards your last question, it raised an issue on page 85 of the book, where Aribiah said that there are no random events. And I think, you just raised that issue with your example of, Celsius and Maldives. So I think, Aribiah, you have to respond to that together with, you made the first point about an eternal first cause, an eternal first cause determining events. Aribiah, maybe you enlighten us more if your first cause is an eternal first cause. Over to you, Jonathan. Then Aribiah, you respond to this set of questions. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Megedu, and thank you those who have spoken. Wonderful engagement. Aribiah, I begin by telling you what I like about your work, because you said you need to also hear what is positive, what is good about the work. I like the audacity of the work. I like the coherence that I see in the arguments from top down. I also like the tricky inbuilt defense mechanism you inserted there for your theory of your conception of determinism, which is the fact that whatever anyone has to say in the future, whatever criticism we can muster, we've been determined to come up with those things. and
exactly.
And that narrowly substantiates all that you have been saying all along. That's a smart one, and I like it. I give it to you. However, let's take a little trip outside your comfort zone. In your chapter 4, where you discuss causality and the chain of relationship, states of affairs interacting, and then you placed God at the beginning. Of course, I wasn't convinced with the defense you gave there. You said that the reason why we had to accept God as the first cause and move on with our lives is because it gives us comfort, okay, to do so instead of this eternal regression. That's no argument. But that's not where I want to tackle you on. Where I want you to really supply me some answers is this. In your chapter 4, you have declared the death of free will. Fantastic, bold, banal. Love that. However, in reading that work, I did not see where you actually discussed the nature of the entity you call determinism. You seem to have taken it for granted that it's a word that means A, B, C, and D, and then you can use it in that order. But in your usage, your conception of that entity is so much loaded that its characteristics need to be defined. So my question is determinism by your own conception an agent or an idea? If it is an agent, then is it not synonymous with the eternal will, God? Okay, if it is synonymous with God, that causes every other chain of events to emerge, then is determinism not eternal will? Number two, if determinism by your own conception is just an idea that you use to express your thoughts, whence come the relational pool, the relational force that brings different states of affairs into interaction? Okay, the idea of a relationship or interaction suggests a pool, and that pool seems more like something that is a product of the will. Now, by your chapter 4, that will be God. And if God is the eternal will that causes every other entity before it into existence, then there's a relationship between this eternal will and every other thing it causes into existence. And if this eternal will causes every other thing into existence, it appears necessary that those things that the eternal will causes into existence must in some way possess some type of will too, without which they will not be able to orchestrate their own interactions and relationships. So the question is, another question for you then is, if you deny all this, if you deny that God is an eternal will, is relationship, interaction between states of affairs possible without the will to pull the things into that relationship? Relationships between things can't just be in a relationship. Something has to pull them. And that sounds more like a will of some sort. If God is the eternal will that causes the other things to come into existence by that relationship, then all those things, for those things to be in a relationship with God, they must possess some type of will or the other, which they also need to engage in relationship with one another and create other states of affairs. That would be it. Thank you, Neged. Over to you.
All right, yeah, thank you for your question. So, Aribiah, over to you, respond to these three sets of questions, then we'll be back to you, Evaristus. Yeah, Aribiah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your questions. Very interesting questions. Let me start with Patrick first, where he talked about the example. It's curious. He talked about the example of quickly changing your vacation destination from the Maldives to the Seychelles, and then claiming that there was no actor or factor influencing your decision. But then at the end of your example, you begin to say, it's sunny in Seychelles just as it is in Maldives. Perhaps that is an actor. Perhaps that is a factor that influenced your decision at the split minute. Perhaps there are other subconscious factors that influenced your decision. So that is not, in my opinion, a good example for free will, the sudden change of mind in the example you provided. Then you mentioned the problem with the example 1 + 1 = 4. That was the generic example. It wasn't a loaded example. I mean, if free will is about making independent decisions, I could decide that from now on in ordinary mathematics, I can freely decide that 1 + 1 would be equals to 4, right? And then it would have to be true because I have freely willed it, but that is impossible. I was just using that as an example to show why the distinct effect is implausible in my opinion. Then you mentioned something about whether human beings can be rational at all and all that. I anticipated the question somewhere in the book. I'll just check now. I think that was, anyway, somewhere in the book I anticipated. The correct question we want to ask, which is a very, very difficult question, was, and I mentioned this in the book, the question about whether determinism is true. So it's kind of like determinism is itself self-defeating, because if determinism is true, then we cannot make any reasonable claims about determinism itself, which then defeats the whole argument. But I tried to give an answer to that question. I'll just look for it now. I tried to give an answer to that question in the chapter somewhere there. But anyway, the idea that I was trying to project is that, yes, it might be an epistemological problem. Okay, yes, in page 88. So I said the summary of the arguments in relation to my metaphysics is this: if our ideas are predetermined by previous state of affairs, there's no justifiable reason to differentiate valid or sound ideas from invalid or unsound ideas, including the idea of determinism itself. And so this is how I respond to the question. I respond to the question by turning to by beginning from ontology and then moving to epistemology. I say rationality or reason is a capacity of the human mind or the human brain, and it is from this capacity that we try to justify our view of the world. To understand how justification works in a predeterministic world such as the one I am describing, we have to retrace our steps back to what we may think of as the origin of rational capacity. The origin is inextricably linked to the origin of life in the evolutionary tale. The emergence of life marks the beginning of the capacity to reason, and this capacity to reason is also linked to the primitive desire in all things to preserve themselves, avoid pain, and seek pleasure, blah, blah, blah. So the main, because it's a long argument, the main point of the argument is that we have, in our bid to avoid pain and seek pleasure, which is part of our capacities as human beings, we've been able to map the world and map the way the world works, right? And so when things begin to, when the way we think begins to align to the way the world is, then that provides justification for the way the world is, for our understanding of the world. And so if my view of determinism is true, like I think it is true because it adequately maps the way the world is. And that is what provides justification for determinism, right? So that's my response to that question. Then you talked about the expansion of the universe and all that stuff. Well, that's also plays into my metaphysics, because I say when things interact, it creates new state of affairs, and in that new state of affairs, there are newer interactions which brings to bear a newer state of affairs, and so on and so forth, and all that. So evolution, deviation in evolution and all that all points to the point I'm making, which is that, In newer state of affairs, there are newer types of interactions which give birth to another state of affairs, and so on and so forth. So evolution does not go against the predeterministic world that I am proposing, right? Instead, it enforces it. It provides good reason to believe in it, right? And then again, to follow that up with the question of whether the first cause is eternal. In the chapter 2, I said, for sure, I know that the first cause is at least regressively eternal, meaning that it has, at least I know it has no beginning. I can make that claim and provide justifiable reasons to make that claim. Now, the first cause might also be progressively eternal, right? But I don't think I have a good enough justification to make that claim. But there are also reasons you can give to think of the world of the first cause as progressively eternal, and that is fine. It is just that for me, I have not found a plausible argument for progressive eternality. Perhaps one argument you can make is they cannot be nothing, right? So something must always exist. So if that is true, then the first cause must always exist, since something that is not contingent must always continue to exist, given the fact that nothingness is impossible. Perhaps that might be a good answer, a good reason to believe that the first cause is progressively eternal. But I am for sure that the first cause is at least regressively eternal as far as my metaphysics is concerned. Then you go to the Jonathan's question, where he wonders whether determinism is an agent or an idea. I do not think determinism is an agent, and I do not think it is merely an idea. I think of it in the same category as what we would call consciousness. Now, let me be much more specific here. Let me clarify a point by saying that it is like consciousness. I am not saying it is consciousness. I'm not saying it is mind. I'm saying it is in the same category of being as consciousness, right? Because in my view, consciousness arises from a conglomeration of various brain states, right? Or states of the human nervous system. In my work on proto-phenomenalism, right? It is just that conglomeration and interaction between various brain states, right? Or various components of the brain. Okay, and that is the same way that determinism works, because it is as the result of the interaction between things in the world, because it is through that interaction that new states of affairs are necessarily created. Okay, and to respond to the question whether where Jonathan seems to suggest that everything must have a will for it to interact. In the book, I do not toe that line. I do not think that is the case. For me, merely existing in the world presupposes interaction. The example I gave was in the book is the example of two peas in the pod, or even a room. You can have an empty room, but once you put something in that empty room, right, then it is no longer an empty room. That is a new state of affairs. The presence of that new thing in that room necessarily creates a new state of affairs. There is no willing involved. It is just the mere existence of that thing that creates a new state of affairs. So for me, it's not a matter of will or anything like that. It is the mere existence of things that necessitates and quite necessarily interactions between those things. In that, at the very least, it creates a new state of affairs. if something pops into existence, if we assume that something pops into existence, then it creates a new state of affairs. At the very least, it creates one more thing in the world. So if for example, we assume that at this in the world that we live in now, there are only 5 human beings. Those are the only beings in the world. Once those human beings reproduce and a new human being appears in the world, or a new being of any kind appears in the world, they necessarily create a new state of affairs. Because at the very least, we no longer have 5 human beings, we have 5 human beings plus one other thing. And that is a new state of affairs in the most basic sense of the word. So the mere existence of things presupposes a new state of affairs. There's no need for including will or anything like that with regards to how things interact. Okay, and then there was something mentioned about irrationality. Negedu, I wonder if you can remind me.
Yes, I think it's a question raised by Maduka, which Patrick also reiterated, the fact that your metaphysics downplays the place of rationality in the human person, and the fact that anything we think, we have actually been programmed to think in a certain way. So that was what Maduka raised, the fact that we do not think freely, but that we are programmed to think.
So we are programmed to think the way we are. By programmed is not, so there are many actors and factors that interact with us and allows us to think the way we think. That might be a better way to put it. And yeah, that's my view on the issue. And I think I used the term irrationality in the previous chapter to describe a world that is generally unintentional, a world that is that has no purpose, right? Because obviously in most metaphysical systems there is a teleology involved, right? And then we are all moving towards achieving this particular universal cosmic purpose and all that. In my world, that is not true. That's why I describe the world as a rational.
Are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I was saying that the reason why I used the term irrational was to show that the metaphysics I propose, the metaphysics that I propose, the world is unintentional, it's not intentional, right? There is no universal purpose for which we all strive for. The world is not some conscious entity, moving towards a particular teleology and all that stuff. So that's what I meant when I used the term irrationality. And then someone mentioned, I remember, I don't think I responded to this question. Someone mentioned something about punishment and my views that I accepted punishment, but at the same time did not propose free will and all that. I did not accept punishment as an expression of free will. What I said was, on the one hand, punishment is an unnecessary response to the negative effect of an individual's actions in terms of holding that individual responsible for his or her actions, on the one hand. But on the other hand, we are predetermined to respond to negative actions by others by punishing them, right? In some point in history, if you take the state of nature seriously, there was no punishment for any bad action. If you were powerful enough to, do anything you wanted to do, you would probably get away with it. But as society, human beings, as the newer state of affairs began to emerge, began to create, it necessitated the creation of courts and all laws and all these other things. And so anytime we encounter something negative, a negative action by someone else, we are predetermined to interact with that person in terms of taking that person to court and putting that person in prison. Sometimes, that's just the way the world is. Remember, the metaphysics is a descriptive one and not a normative one. It's not a normative metaphysics, right? So that's the point I was making. It's not that I am accepting that punishment is possible in terms of allowing free will. It is, I was just saying that is where the world is right now, that we respond to certain actions by punishing, even though there's no real reason to do so.
Okay. Okay. I understand that now. Evaristus, we'll be back to you, please. Let me just read from the chat box some of the contributions and questions. Aribiah, please, you note them. Then I'll be back to Evaristus. The first one is from Adagada, which he said, my main issue with, the predeterministic historicity is the conception of God and rigid determinism. Both issues were briefly explored in my soon arriving review of Groundwork and a forthcoming paper, which I devoted a lengthy footnote to Aribiah's rigid determinism. More creative exploration will happen in the immediate and near future. Okay, that seems like, a take on your work. Then from Amara, you have a question from Amara. She said, this is a beautiful piece. Well done, Aribiah. My question is this: what makes humans different? For example, from robots that are mechanically structured to inevitably act in certain ways, if humans are determined to always behave the way they do.
Okay,
what makes humans different? Okay, you take those two.
Yeah. I think that question is more of a comment than a question. He's just saying he has a problem with my idea of God and all that. Like I said earlier in the book, I can only make claims about God based on what I can justify. I cannot make outlandish claims like most metaphysicians like to do. I can only talk about what I think I can logically justify. And that's what I presented in the book. If there are more points that I can also logically justify in the future, maybe I'll add it there. But for now, that is what I can logically justify. I cannot make wild claims like most people do based on really nothing, But that's it. That's by the way. Then to Amara's point, what makes us different from robots that are mechanically structured to inevitably act in certain ways and all that. But then my question to Amara is, what makes us special? There's really nothing that makes us special. We are at the mercy of other predeterministic factors and predetermined interactions. That could as well wipe us out. There's really nothing special about the human being. I don't know where, human beings develop this sense of grandeur, illusion of grandeur. There's really nothing special about human beings. So that would be my response to Amara's question. If we have this egotistical attitude to life, to think that we are the center of the universe, everything revolves around us, we have free will, we can do and undo, but really we are at the mercy of, interactive relationships. Anything can happen at any time, so that would be my response to Amara's point.
So your response to Amara, I want to use her words specifically, that nothing makes us different.
No, my view is nothing makes us special. We are all part of this particular state of affairs, and who knows, in the future, we may not be part of the state of affairs that might come to pass. You know, we are just part of this, we are just part of the interactive relationships that exist in this state of affairs for now. So it is not that we are like robots. I don't want to say that we are like robots or anything, because that implies certain other things that I don't want to go into. I don't want to make that comparison between humans and robots. But my point is, there is nothing that makes us special. If we are the same like robots in the sense that we are also part of this state of affairs and we are interacting, we are also susceptible to the interactions that exist in this state of affairs and newer state of affairs that would emerge from that interaction.
Okay, I think I still go back to her question. I want to stick to the use of the word different that she used. I don't want to interchange it with special.
Okay.
So she is asking that, so from your response, are you saying nothing makes us different? I don't want to use special and different interchangeably. So is there nothing that makes us different?
We are different types of beings from robots, right? I think what she wants to ask is, are we different in the sense of we are mechanical? That is, our lives are moving, I don't know how I'm going to, like, our lives are, you know, structured and programmed to be in a certain way. We are programmed to behave in a certain way, just like robots are programmed to be in a certain way. If you're thinking of it in that sense, I would say, yes, we are predetermined in that way. All our actions are you know, come from previous state of affairs, previous interactions in previous state of affairs, and that allows us to act in the way we do. But if you're saying as beings, whether we are distinct from robots, obviously we are distinct from robots, the same way that the human being is distinct from a chair or a table or anything like that.
Okay, is it not because then, the follow-up question, is it not because we are different that we become special?
Sorry?
Is it not because we are different? Now you've acknowledged the fact that we are different, right? So is it not because we are different that we also become special?
Well, a table is different from a computer. Does it make it special or anything like that? It depends on what you mean by special. If you mean unique,
By special.
If you mean unique in terms of I have hands and the table does not have a hand, or I am conscious and the robot is not conscious, yes, we are different, or yes, we are unique. But if you mean special in the sense of the human being has a special place in the universe and all that, the human being is the center of the universe, we can live our lives the way we want and nothing can happen to us, blah, blah, blah. All those are illusions of grandeur.
Okay, well, we'll be back to that. Let me take Evaristo's answer. So Evaristo, please make a contribution.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Negudu. I must confess that Arabia's work is a novel idea, which also I've also learned a new way of philosophizing. Maybe I try to open an open-ended approach to reality, and also learn how to be smart like Arabia. Then let me move to my question. My first problem is with PDH and issue of social and transitional justice. I would like to come from the angle of morality. You say that that we do acknowledge punishment, that you acknowledge punishment, but a mere acknowledgement of an act does not imply justice. For example, if someone perpetrates a particular act and you acknowledge that, for example, Nero did a particular thing, and then you say that he was predetermined to perform a particular act. So by that virtue, he is not morally responsible for his actions. And if he is not morally responsible for his actions, he cannot be punished. If he cannot be punished, then we cannot restitute the whole social framework he has distorted. And that will take us to the principle, to the fact that social justice and transitional justice cannot be achieved. So the whole yearning of humanity for justice is an illusion. And if that is the case, it implies that
The determiner of the universe has determined the universe to be in a kind of a social injustice framework that justice cannot be achieved, which also tells us that evil is also created by this particular determiner, the phase cause. If the evil is also determined by this phase cause, it implies that the phase cause has a kind of evil around him. Evil is part of his existence. If evil is part of the existence, it means that the total yearning of humanity to achieve that kind of a perfect world outside is an illusion, because this evil is still part of the phase cause. And now, secondly, the idea of the phase cause, if it's traced back to God, as you've shown, it implies that God is the phase cause. If God is the phase cause, the understanding of God from the African perspective, God does not reveal his mind to human beings because of a kind of a distance between human beings and the God. And this God must not necessarily be a kind of a revealed God of the European Christianity, but a different understanding of God from African traditional religion. If that is the case, you seem to bring a kind of a Western understanding or conception of God that structured the universe. And after structuring the universe, he absconded. Now we are just seeking to understand and to also explore the universe. In our attempts to explore the universe, will we determine to understand the universe the way it is, or we use our rationality to kind of explore all these things? My issue is that if the universe was determined, there must be a boundary set for this determination. If I determine something, I'll create boundaries to which that thing will stop. But reality is not a given, because on a daily basis, we keep on discovering different things that are outside of our expectations, things we do not expect that it will happen this way, things that we do not expect that will take this particular dimension. And you're telling us that these things were determined. So how will all these things determined in such a way that on a daily basis, we keep on discovering new ways, alternatives? We have alternatives, we have other things that are coming, and we cannot even tell for sure that this thing will surely occur without resorting to the past. Then the last issue I have is the issue of moral obligation and this PDH. If everything is determined, I was determined to act in a particular way, so I must also follow that way. So the idea of my moral obligation to do a particular thing does not even come. So if I choose to be wicked, I was determined to be wicked. So society should not hold me morally responsible for my wicked attitude or disposition, because I was determined. So this PDH seems to violate or remove the idea of moral obligation and responsibility. That's my problem.
Okay, yeah, well, thank you, Evaristus. While you asked your question, I smiled because most parts of your questions fall under the category of what Jonathan referred to as the tricky nature of the metaphysics of Arabia, which of course provides answers for even future questions that people will ask. But your first question also goes back to the problem of evil, the fact that from Arabia's metaphysics, Aribiah Evaristus is saying that from your metaphysics, evil could also be traced back to the first cause. So what do you have to say about his question?
With regards to evil, I'll start from evil before then answering Evaristus's many interesting questions. Thank you, Evaristus, for your question. I don't know whether it is in this book or perhaps a certain article that was published in Philosophia Theoretica, where I talked about the problem of evil from predeterministic, from the perspective of predeterministic historicity. In that work, I called evil, or I described evil as, a human understanding of things that are not to their own benefit, right? So evil is really a human thing, because we want to avoid pain. We describe anything that causes us pain as evil. If human beings did not exist, evil would not exist. So I don't like using the term evil in the sense that people like to use the term evil. I do not think of it as, this sort of special phenomenon, that when you then trace it back to God, it means God is necessarily evil, blah, 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 all the things that follow from that. Evil is just it's a category of the human mind. It's not out there in the world. That's the first point. Then Evaristus talked about transitional justice, blah, blah, and all that stuff. Yes, in my metaphysics, like if you read the section on morality and responsibility, you shouldn't really be talking about justice. What really is justice? Trying to find people responsible for certain actions, punishing them or praising them and all that stuff. No, everything is predetermined. You can't really talk about justice. It is just that, human beings, due to, previous interactions and new states of affairs that emerge from that interaction, we like to act in ways where we provide laws and then punish people according to those laws. That's just the way the world is. But in reality, if you want to take predeterministic historicity seriously, then you cannot take the idea of morality or justice or anything, all those things seriously, right? If I manage to have many people interact with my work, and through that interaction, they are convinced of my views, then we live in a world that is truer to the way the world is, where morality and justice are just figments of our imaginations. They don't really exist, because you really can't hold anyone responsible if you take PDH seriously. Then you mentioned something about, I don't remember, you mentioned something about God being the first cause. Could you repeat that question? I think it was the second question.
Evaristus.
Okay, if God is the first cause of or the determiner of everything, God must have structured the universe in such a way that everything's supposed to have limits. Since it has been determined, there is a limit for everything, but on daily basis, it seems that reality is not a given.
Oh, yes. I remember that point. So my response to this, so what you're trying to say is new things just pop up, there are new events in the world that some of them we don't even really expect them to happen, and they do happen and all that stuff. Well, the reason why that happens is because, again, like I said in the book, the human being is quite limited in his knowledge. We cannot fully grasp every single actor and factor that exists in the world. That's number one. Number two, we cannot fully grasp every single interactive relationship that exists in this present state of affairs. You cannot fully grasp it. If human beings were capable of grasping every single interaction that happens in this particular state of affairs, and if human beings were capable of knowing every single actor and factor that exists in the world, we would be comfortable enough to predict the future and anticipate every single event that happens or that will happen in the world. But we don't have that capacity. We barely know anything about ourselves, not less of every actor and factor that exists in the world. So it is just a matter of the incapability of the human mind to comprehend every single thing that exists in the world. A stronger question that would have, stifled me a bit would have been one that pointed to, the subatomic world, the quantum world, where things like indeterminacy, things that can be this one thing and another thing at the same time, produce different outcomes, different state of affairs at the same time. That would have been a stronger question for which I have no answer to, except that perhaps the human mind is still yet incapable of grasping things in the quantum world. But of course, one can say perhaps that answer might not be sufficient. And I admit that I do not know how predeterminism will work in the quantum world. And I also admit that it focuses on the macro world. And that is fine, right? So to answer that second question, the reason why we think all these random events happen, things just pop out of existence and, events just happen, is because we do not fully grasp every single state of affairs or every single actor and factor that exists in the world. That would be my view. Then I think your last question is covered by my response to the idea that within PDH morality, you can't really talk about morality. Even without PDH itself, morality is still a tricky thing to talk about. What does morality mean? If you read A.J. Ayer and you read David Hume, you begin to question why you should even take ethics seriously. You're making ethical propositions that can neither be true or false, so why take it seriously, right? You talk about moral sense, but what does that even mean? Is there any justifiable reason to be moral? No. The only justifiable reason, which is a very weak reason for why we should be moral, is because we live in a community and there are rules of engagement and we just ought to obey them in order to flourish. That is the only reason. If we were self-sufficient, morality would be nonsense, really. There is no justifiable reason to be moral. I dare anyone to provide me with a justifiable reason to be moral. There is none. So even out of the context of PDH, you can't talk about morality. All right, so yeah, that would be my response to your very interesting question. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Aribiah, for your responses. I understand the fact that we still have, many contributions, questions coming in on the chat box because of the complex nature of this book and the chapter in particular. But, well, we may have to round up now, and, well, we'll continue this conversation on probably our WhatsApp chat. So please, those questions and contributions I have not been able to take on the chat box. Sorry about that. Well, we'll continue later. So any information for us, Aribiah, before we close?
Thank you very first. Thank you all for being here and for engaging with me and engaging my work. I really appreciate that. Our next reading meeting would be 3 weeks from now, which is the 9th of July. And I would post the work we are going to look at maybe later today or tomorrow. And I would also like to remind us, I made this announcement the last time, I think, that please send me your work, your article, your book, or whatever that you would like for us to read here. Send us your work, and then I'll try and schedule it, and then we read everybody's work, right? So don't be shy. Send us any work you feel is important for us to read. Send it. I would also look out for the works of other CSP members that are interesting and that we can engage with and all that. And then because this meeting is meant for us to, read ourselves, and understand and know what our members are doing, so we can confidently talk about other people's work, confidently engage with other people's work, and confidently write about other people's work and cite them, right? That is one of the aims of this meeting. So if you have a work, please, a paper or whatever, please don't be shy, send it to me. I'll look at it, and then we'll try our best to schedule it and have a read. I see Ben has his hands up.
Okay, thank you. Since philosophy is not limited to written works, otherwise we wouldn't be having all these proverbs, philosophic sagacity, and the rest. I'm an aesthetician myself, so I take a lot of beautiful pictures of nature. If you're an artist, a philosopher of nature, can you send in your natural pictures, and it can also receive philosophical criticism?
If you send me your picture, that is fine. I'll use it and share screen, so that as we are having this wonderful discussions. We can look at your picture of the Maldives and all that, and have inspirations there.
So, sorry, my own. I don't know if I can hold on to the floor. My own question is, must the work must it be an already published work? You know, because sometimes we have a theory you are trying to bring up, but it hasn't gone through the process of publication yet. But you feel is something quite interesting and critically engaging. So must it be an already published work? And if it must be, how about a case where you have a co-authored work with somebody? Can you still share it in this platform for critical analysis or whatever? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think if it's a co-authored work, I guess we can read it. I don't immediately see a problem with that. With regards to unpublished work, I would have to discuss with our convener because the initial plan was to read published work. Perhaps if you have any unpublished work you want to sound to us, to have us look at it and give you critical responses to it. Maybe you want to publish it somewhere. Perhaps we can organize something different, where those who are available can come through and respond. Well, not those who are available, where we can come through and respond to your work and all that, separate from the reading group. But I would discuss with the convener about that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Moderator, if you would allow me.
Yes.
Since Aribiah has called me out. The essence of this CSP reading session from the beginning has always been to discuss published works that are at their strongest. Okay, but we also have a program we call MSG. That is a program where someone comes and presents an unpublished work, and then we engage with it. For some time now, we have paused that program. The last convener, the last coordinator of that program was, and I think still is, Dr. Bunaya. But so that's where we discuss unpublished works, but this one is purely published works, so that we get to know each other's work as members of the CSP, cite them, engage them in our research robustly, and even extend some of the ideas that people have teased out. So these things we are reading, when you see someone's work that you like, the idea, you just feel that the person has not expressed it the way you would want to express it, or you disagree with some aspects of that work, you go ahead and write your own essay on that work and extend it in that direction. Okay, that's what we are doing here. So Nelson is really published works, but hey, co-authored works are also fine because they are published as well. Thank you.
Thank you,
moderator.
All right. Yeah. Well, I thank all of you for your presence today. And while we continue our conversations on the WhatsApp platform, we'll say we'll meet in 3 weeks' time, and enjoy your weekend, even though it has been predetermined. Yeah. So.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Let's continue on the chat box on the WhatsApp platform.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.